Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast, where I give you practical Stoic advice for modern times. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Simon Drew. I also do one-on-one mindset coaching, and you can book in your first free consultation by going to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching. On Facebook, you can join my group, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But for now, enjoy this episode. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. You know, this podcast has just brought so many amazing, intelligent, beautiful people into my life, and I've been so grateful for that. And today's guest is no exception to that. Today we have Nancy Sherman, and many of you will know Nancy. She wrote a book called Stoic Warriors, and it's all about how Stoicism is kind of like the underlying philosophy behind the military mind. And she's such an interesting person, such a wonderful person to talk to, and I was so grateful that she gave us her time today to come on the podcast. And so for those of you who don't know of Nancy Sherman, I'll give you a little bit of a blurb about her. So Nancy Sherman is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. She was the inaugural Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the United States Naval Academy, which inspired some of her books, including Stoic Warriors, After War, and The Untold War. She has spent a considerable amount of time studying Stoicism, which she believes is the underlying philosophy of the military. She received a bachelor's in philosophy from Bryn Mawr College in 1973, and then she went on to receive a master's in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh in 1976, and her doctorate from Harvard University in 1982. And so that's Nancy Sherman for you, and you know, as you can understand, I was so excited to have her on the show. She is so highly qualified to be talking about philosophy and Stoicism, and you know, how we can use it in our lives to make our lives better, and also we get into some really interesting discussions about, you know, some of the downfalls of Stoicism and some of the areas where she thinks that it could improve. So I think that that's really exciting to talk about that sort of stuff as well. And before I get into the interview, I have a couple of things to say. Firstly, it astounds me how many times I make silly mistakes in life, but that is a part of the human condition. I understand that. But in this interview, I completely forgot to change the microphone over to the professional microphone, and so you'll be hearing my voice through the Apple headphone speakers. So I do apologize for that, but I hope that it doesn't take away from the experience too much, because really this is such a great interview with such an amazing person, and I really want you to hear it and learn what she has to teach. So without any further ado, I present to you all Nancy Sherman. All right, so Nancy, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that you're a busy woman and you've got a lot going on, but really grateful that you took the time. And I've already told my audience a little bit about you in the show notes and everything like that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you do it?
Sounds good. So I'm Nancy Sherman, and I'm an academic. I teach at Georgetown and have taught there for about several decades. And before that, taught at Yale University. Sometime in the mid-90s, I was asked to help deal with ethics teaching at the Naval Academy in the States. And when I did that, I organized a standard straight-up ethics course that you get in universities, but I included the Stoics, since I do ancient philosophy, and that's one of my specializations. And there was a Stoic philosopher, namely Epictetus, who was very influential to a naval officer, namely James Stockdale, who was a Vietnam prisoner of war, POW, around during the Vietnam War, and a colleague and fellow officer with John McCain. So my students, as well as officers, so midshipmen and officers of all ranks, including admirals, were extremely smitten by Stoic philosophy. They took to it like a duck takes to water. So I ended up thinking about that and writing a book, Stoic Warriors, on the blessings and curses of Stoicism and the much richer account of Stoicism that the ancient philosophers have than you get in Epictetus even, or some pop versions of Stoicism. So I do ethical philosophy. I work on the emotions. I have a psychoanalytic background as well, a bit of a background in psychotherapy, although I don't practice. And I've written books on ancient philosophy. My most recent book was called After War, with in-depth treatment of soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines coming home from war and the moral injuries that they face. And before that, it was Untold War, and before that, Stoic Warriors. So Stoic Warriors was kind of the beginning of a trilogy to do with the war ethos and the moral hazards on those who participate in war. There's a start.
That's an amazing start, and this is why I'm so excited to have you on the podcast, because I really do think that you just have such an in-depth knowledge of Stoicism and the military, and I'm very interested in this link between the military and Stoicism. I've had a couple of military members on my podcast, and absolutely there does seem to be a link there. And maybe we could start with that, because obviously the book that I would highly recommend that anybody who's interested in Stoicism would read is called Stoic Warriors, the Ancient Philosophy Behind the Military Mind. And you mentioned that this all started with you serving with was it the U.S. Naval Academy?
Yes.
And so what do you think are the main links between sort of the military mind and Stoic philosophy? Like what was really the main connection there?
Well, the military is largely requires of its community, of its cadre, that you suck it up. You know, you deal with deprivation, you deal with hardship, you form a corps or a cadre where you give up a lot in order to be part of a community that often suffers a lot of denial, degradation to some degree by being subordinated in a command structure, and also being in unfamiliar countries. You also inflict a lot of harm, sometimes horribly unjustified harm, and you suffer guilt, sometimes justified, sometimes not. You live with the scars and harms and aftermath of war for a lifetime, and your family for longer than that. And some individuals sort of feel that a way of minimizing your attachments to the world, your dependence on others, your vulnerability to vicissitudes of life is a way of going forth and strengthening yourself or hardening yourself. I think ultimately it isn't, so I am not an advocate of the kind of compartmentalization that sometimes is involved in Stoic mentalities. However, I think as someone who's a teacher and who teaches this stuff to undergraduates and others, having just come out of classrooms teaching it to Georgetown undergraduates, there's something very appealing in a take charge mentality and a way of representing the world so that you're not as dependent on on attachments and losses. I think it comes at great cost and it's dangerous. And I think that more subtle Stoic thinkers understand that, like Seneca. And Cicero isn't a Stoic, but he struggles with the death of his own daughter in childbirth, and never quite gets over that mourning. And he's honest about all the therapies that he's tried and the degree to which they don't work. So it's appealing. Epictetus is very epigrammatic. You can kind of recite it to yourself. You can read it. I think it's got blessings and curses. So that's the academic side of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd really like to talk about that more later on in the interview as well. But I was interested in knowing, so you worked with the Navy regarding their ethics. You're on the chair of ethics there. And I wanted to know, if this is all classified information, that's fine, and you don't have to get into it. But I was wondering, were you called there for specific problems that they were facing at the time? And if so, what were some of the main problems that you saw, and how did you kind of help to remedy those problems with philosophy?
Well, I was called in a very public scandal.
Mm-hmm.
There was in the mid-90s an electrical engineering cheating scandal or compromise of an exam that had been circulated in advance of the taking of the exam. Is a required course and a required examination, and so there was a theft of the exam from a professor's office. And so many of those students knew in advance what the questions were, and they profited as a result of that. And it being an honor-bound community, some of those who knew that they were getting stolen goods did not come forward to report from the others on the others, and it was a royal mess at a time when there were lots of other things going on in the Navy, including sexual harassment scandals among the naval aviators called tailhook. So there were a lot of things happening. Annapolis, Maryland is very close to Washington, D.C., so it was under a spotlight. I was called in to help, quote unquote, morally remediate the situation. That's a kind of antiseptic term, but essentially they wanted an ethics course of the sort I always teach. I had one at Harvard. I taught them at Yale, where we go through theories and think about how they apply to situations and hard cases. And I devised or constructed such a course, and I soon I was their first distinguished chair. And essentially we taught ethics. And my teaching assistants were officers, and my students were the whole class of second-year students called youngsters. The midshipmen are called youngsters when they're second year. So that's not unusual for military academies. What was difficult was, at the same time there was teaching going on, there was a national investigation, because you bring in an inspector general. These are midshipmen are paid government salaries to go to university, and so it falls under that rubric. And there was also more personal kinds of reflection and diary writing and social service to the community, and, as I say, legal proceedings. So it was a complicated time. But the long and short is that they had always been teaching ethics, but probably not in such an organized way. And all to the better, they now take it rather seriously, and it's critical, because there are people that lead troops in the most morally gray circumstances imaginable, where the causes of war are very unclear. Whether you should be going to war is unclear and might be disputed, but certainly can be. And how much collateral damage to assume, leaving a country in better conditions than when you found it, are always ambiguous. The status of war when it's endless, and victories are not at all victories, as we now know, in places like Tal Afar and Mosul and Kandahar and Baghdad. So all of that is stuff that I'm really happy to say the military academies in the States, and I presume also in Australia, are taking very, very seriously. And they're part of a thinking soldier's education, really, and they have to be. Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's a little taste of it. Mhm.
I love it, and I think that it's really really interesting for people to hear that these institutions such as the military, and even we know that companies often get involved in having philosophy be a main thing that they teach within that community, because I mean, I'm sure you would agree that many of the problems that we see in the world today aren't necessarily problems of the actions that people are doing, but it's a problem that starts with the philosophy behind those actions. And there is always a need to go a little bit deeper into learning the correct way to be thinking and the correct way to be living your life in any institution. But I was wondering, I mean, with you, you've obviously, it seems like you've made your life's work uh, evolve around, philosophy and the military. So you mentioned earlier you've got two other books other than the one that I mentioned, which are called After War and The Untold War. Uh, so was this role that you had in the Navy, was this your first introduction to the military? And if so, what was it that made the military stick with you and made you want to go even deeper into the military mind?
Well, there are those three books, and that sort of began in the 90s
Mm,
with the invitation to go to the Naval Academy. We had just, in America, been bringing folks home from the first Gulf War. Um, some of my fellow colleagues and officers were returning from a place called the Basra Road, where they had flyovers or were in the no-fly zones, um, not knowing that they would be back at those sites 10, 15 years later.
mm,
Um, I found the community compelling. I was very much an outsider, almost like an anthropologist. I found that my stereotypes regarding the military were very, very off. I am a child of the 60s. I grew up during the Vietnam War. It was very, very tumultuous. Ken Burns' recent documentary of upwards of 13 episodes that ran on PBS, our public
mm,
broadcast system, is a remarkable, remarkable documentary of that period. That was my period. And it was a period for conscription. So everyone I knew was subject to the draft,
mm,
as long as they were men. Women were not conscripted. Many of the officers that I worked with were of that period, but they were in the Mekong Delta or they were prisoners of war in Hanoi. So I saw a part of my formative years from a very different point of view. I wasn't at a march in Washington for a moratorium on Cambodia, but rather was now hearing about what it was like to be in Vietnam during that period,
mm,
1968, 1972, 1967, 1972, where people weren't draftees, but rather officers who had come out of West Point or Naval Academy or the like. And that was eye-opening. It all of a sudden unpolarized the world for me in a certain way. For all of us, I think it was very important. We are now in a period where as I told my undergraduates yesterday, their whole life has as its background sound that America has been in war. Many of them were born 2 years before 9/11, 2 years before 2001, and none of them have been vulnerable to the draft, conscription, or feel the pain and anguish of war. Whatever's going on that's tumultuous in the political climate, in the state, in the world, globally, it is not the ongoing war.
mm,
Maybe Korea, maybe environmental change, maybe transgenders, certainly hashtag Me Too, women's issues that are finally coming up for full review, but not war. And that's in some ways horrible because a lot is going on without buy-in and without a concerned populace. So that's part of the background. I think my own work needs to take more seriously, not just soldiers, but civilians, state department, peace workers, collateral, all those interpreters, runners, journalists, all those who are part of war effort that don't get put into the fuller scene. But that's only a part of my work. My work is I'm an ancient philosopher, so I come to this from the texts. It's only interesting to me because it's rich and deep and not simple. And I'm very interested in the emotions, and my current work is on dance and the emotions and dynamic movement, and how emotions get expressed and not bottled up, but are visible in emotional expression. So, I've got various irons in the fire and ways of thinking about my work that interface with interests out there.
Yeah, and maybe I could go to the wider view of your life's work and maybe ask, so obviously, would you agree that philosophy is your greatest love in life in terms of where you put your effort into learning and teaching?
Well, I am a professional, so if I have to count the hours of the day,
it
is how I writing a lecture, convincing 122 students that Aristotle's worth reading, motivating them to read it, mentoring TAs. So I wouldn't have a dreamy romantic view of this all. I work for a living. Yeah. I get up in the morning and have to show up in class on time, and I have to grade papers. I have to give kids PhDs. Of course. They have to find jobs. It's being an academic is a way of being salaried as well. I don't roam the agora like Socrates looking for picking an argument, nor do I have little Talmudic studies with fellow rabbinic students. Yeah. But it's certainly it's the discipline I chose. I don't like silos though at all. I think the world needs to break down barriers, and you're a good philosopher if you can read a bit about psychiatry and understand a little bit about neurobiology. You're a good philosopher if you understand literature and you read novels. You're a good philosopher if you can write well and you read the newspaper and know what's going on. So I think and you're a good philosopher if you care a lot about truth and evidence and argument. And I think that's probably the most important and most worrisome concern right now in the world.
Yeah, and maybe would you mind if I went right back to the start and said when did you first decide that philosophy was what you wanted to spend your life researching and teaching, and why did it appeal to you so much?
Well, it was a pretty pragmatic, practical decision of deliberation by elimination. When I was a high school student, I somehow got obsessed with the question of what's humanity, and that led me to read anthropology. So I thought a lot about anthropology and Margaret Mead and folks like that. And when I got to college at Bryn Mawr, the anthropology course was physical, so it was about fossils and bones, and that didn't quite appeal. So I nixed that one. And then I thought, well, maybe psychology. So again, over my summer holidays as a high school student, I had read Freud's interpretation of dreams, which I found very captivating and seemed to ring true to a lot of dreams I had. And so there seemed to be something repeated and universal, if you like, in some of what he was recounting. And I went to Bryn Mawr again with that in mind. And for a year or two, I ran rats in a lab because behavioral psychology and B.F. Skinner's psychology was very much the fad in that period. And so I thought, I don't really want to spend my time tweaking the thalamus gland or of a rat. Then I tried literature, but it was, Faulkner was great, and I really liked Faulkner, but it was very much about how Faulkner says things as opposed to what he says and what it means. So you sort of get the drift. So I fell into philosophy because the other things that I thought would take me to answer these questions weren't quite the places that I could get purchased. And so it was process of elimination. And I also went to a very, very rigoristic women's college in the States. And we all were expected to become professionals in some way, doctors, lawyers, or professors. So going to graduate school kind of suited me. I was very scholastic, and so that's how it came about. Again, I wouldn't say it was a big romantic dream, but it was something that suited my temperament and kept me asking questions and helping me find some answers.
And look, obviously, it's led you down a great path because your work has obviously influenced a lot of people to live better lives. And obviously, you would be a big proponent for everything that's going on with the scandal behind how men have historically treated women within the professional sphere, especially. Maybe, could you offer any sort of encouragement to the women in my audience who, understand that for so long philosophy has been something widely dominated by men? It's just been the case. But, would you offer any sort of encouragement to them about moving forward with their studies of philosophy and their practice as well?
Yeah, I think the academic sphere can be a more open place than some other corridors of power. Not always, but in some ways. And I've certainly been the only woman in a room of men, and have worked hard, I felt, to open up some of the avenues of opportunity. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, we founded something called the Women Students Coalition. That was in the mid-70s, 1970s, arguing that there weren't enough tenured women on the Harvard faculty across all schools: medical, law, business, school of government, arts and science. And we presented our findings, which were anecdotal surveys based on all women's reporting from all the schools, to Derek Bach, who was president of Harvard at the time, and to the dean, and got some sort of commitment that we would that it would be taken seriously. And I think some of those recommendations were, that we got a meeting and that we published our stuff was, I think, to our credit. The movements go on, and we were, by and large, white women in higher education, and that's only a small sector of women that need to be empowered. So I had a woman advisor that was very critical to my growth, Martha Nussbaum, and she took me very seriously. And probably it was very inspiring. And I also had a remarkable advisor, John Rawls, the probably greatest political philosopher of the 20th century, who took his women students really seriously and promoted our careers. So I was blessed. And, I think you just have to sort of be open, and also make sure you get your voices heard on the floor. And not necessarily play the old boy game. So I think it's important, and I think for example, I don't think Stoic philosophy is necessarily the way to go. It turns off a lot of what women are very good at being sensitive to: attachments, the importance of relationships, the hurt when certain persons are denied respect or dignity, and the acknowledgement that things outside your control, when your folks die, if you're stuck as a woman often is taking care of parents in a way the males in the family often aren't, that you figure out what to do with that and don't just sort of saddle it up as one of the things that is dealt to you as on your plate and you can't do much about it. I think all these things are, women have a lot to offer, lots of perspectives are not necessarily their own, but the attached side of women and attached family side of women needs to really be taken seriously in the office place, in the business place, and in the academy, and thinking about parental leave and raising children and all that.
And maybe this would be a good place to go to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think are the main limitations of Stoicism and how can we remedy them? And could we maybe even talk about, because I know that you've been very interested in how we can strike this balance between, feeling these emotions that are seemingly appropriate emotions to be felt at certain times in our lives, and yet also remaining strong and in control of our reactions to those emotions. So, sorry, I know that was many questions
No, that's fine.
in one.
I think the Stoics themselves are the best sources. They struggle hard with how to give due to emotional responsiveness and how also to retain your equanimity. And they squirm and get a bit slippery at times in order to find that balance. So, for example, they make lots of slicing and dicing, as Aristotle would put it, so to speak. They're emotions that are proto-emotions. They're not full assents to the threats or the goods or the bads that are out there, and so you have an autonomic response. Okay, we now call that blushing. We call it various kinds of arousals, erections, hair standing up on end, flinching, crying, etc. So they throw a lot in, but they say, oh, they're not real emotions. They're just the preludes to emotions. That's Seneca's term. And then they say the real ones are ones you can say yay or nay to, and you can assent or not assent to the impression of the good or bad that's before you. Okay, that's fine. And they give you a large classification of 4 of them. Fears to do with dangers in the offing, pleasure to do with desires for good in the offing, current pleasures and current distress at pain. And then they say, well, we should limit how we respond to, we should limit our reactions to those, and even the thoughts that there are real goods and bads out there. They're just indifference. But you know what? There really are some good emotions. So let's give them some space too. And they have a special class. They call them the good emotions, the eupathei. And those are going to be the ones that are reasonable pleasure, reasonable desire, reasonable fear or wariness, where no distress, because that would just set you off the course of tranquility. And they have a whole story about how these are suitably calibrated to understanding the indifference in the world, that they're preferred and dispreferred and not really goods or bads, and your own wisdom or sage-like qualities or virtue. But so they sneak them back in and they give them a different name, and that's all very complicated. Lots and lots of ink has been spilled on figuring out, is it a consistent picture? Is it a lot of bosh, etc. But at very least, you can say they struggle hard with putting emotions back in a way that might nonetheless represent a way that they can be suffered with equanimity, you might say, or with utmost control and comportment. And what I like about the Stoics is their aspiration for that. It's not the success, it's that they take it as a challenge. And that's exciting because we all feel that challenge. We feel the challenge to be more in control than we are, but we should always be aware of the danger of self-management. That's just fake. That's turning us into automaton. And anyone that leads troops or is a teacher and has students depending on you and modeling themselves after you in some strange ways, because you are strangely important in their lives for periods of time, much even though you don't necessarily know it or consciously are aware of it. They want to see that you have affect and that you can shed a tear and that you know that certain things are important. And if you have a death in your family, that you're not an automaton. And they want to have their grief or their condolences adequately registered by you as important because they go through those too. So the Stoics do a lot to be Roman. They're largely, many of them are Roman, and they're living with a lot of decorum and control, and they have a lot of stuff out there. Nero is evil, and they got to keep him in abeyance. If you're Seneca, you got to keep the emperor in abeyance and not let him shoot you down. But Seneca commits suicide in the end because he just can't. He's going to lose his reason, or else he's got to give in. So there's great limits, and it's an aspirational philosophy that I think, in the best of the practitioners, it knows its limits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important that we know those limits, and I know that something that is talked about often is the Stoics have said in their writings that this is not the end to our learning. There's not a monopoly of truth. As we go forward throughout history, we need to be learning the important pieces of information that can help us in life and adding that to our wisdom. And that includes adding to a Stoic philosophy and really modernizing it. And I think that it's important that people do that because it's true. It would be dangerous to go through life saying, I'm not going to feel these emotions. I'm not going to feel these emotions. You bottle that up, and then, as I'm sure you'll agree, it has to come out sometime. And I even think of a quote from Epictetus where he was saying, there is a time for being rational and making rational choices, and then there is a time for being polite. So if somebody is telling you their life story and getting emotional and telling you about how they struggled with this or struggled with that, that's not the time to say, well, you're not being rational by getting emotional about this. You shouldn't be feeling these emotions. That's the time for saying, I understand you. And I'm here for you for being polite. So I think there are a lot of areas where they, as you say, they struggle with it, and they do try to fix these limitations. But
yeah,
I was wondering, do you have a favorite Stoic philosopher? And if so, who is it, and why are they your favorite?
I think my favorite is Seneca.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way Seneca writes. I also think he's honest. He's not a proselytizer. He struggles. He's the patient as well as the doctor. I mean, he knows that Stoic philosophy is a therapy, a therapia for curing the quote-unquote diseases that are the emotions. But he's close enough to Cicero to know that all those words like diseases, that was just Cicero's way of translating emotions, and got inherited into the Enlightenment. But it's kind of overblown, and it's glossed. It's a glossing. And so he reveals that he too cried when his friend died. as he's writing to someone else. He also he writes very movingly, I think, about the nature of anger and how it's what it looks like when it's ablaze and how destructive it is, but also how hard it is to control. And he also writes about movingly about emotional reactions, emotional reactions that are parts of transactions. You know, if I show you beneficence, the response is typically gratitude, and then I might respond to your gratitude. So there's this circling motion and looping back that's part of a lot of social dynamic interaction, and some of which has moral flavor. And he's very good in describing that triadic, or that, dyadic back and forth, and how it works in with our manners and our presentations of self. That's part of social space. And, I think philosophies of social space, of social interaction, that are subtle about the uptake and if your message is heard, and what social address is like, and how you acknowledge others in social space. Those are really important, and I think we're at the brink of losing some of that as we pass everyone with pods in our ear and just don't even give eye contact to people or acknowledge that they're in our space. So I think, Seneca really is a humanizing philosopher.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the greatest traits of Seneca is that he is that person who is kind of like all of us. Obviously he was very wealthy. He was involved in politics. You could tell that he still very deeply wanted the nice things of the world and to be a part of that world. But as you say, he did struggle with that, and he was trying to remedy that, and he would say it in his writings and say, listen to me, but don't listen so closely that you see. He had many, many faults, and I think that we can all identify with that. And I'm so grateful for the time that you've given me today to talk to you about all this. And I just had one more question for you. Every week on the podcast, we have a weekly question for the listeners, and they have a chance to answer this question and have it read on the podcast. And so I thought I'd ask you this week's question as well. And I'd like to know, could you tell us about somebody who has had an extremely positive impact on your life, and maybe why it was that they had such a big impact on you?
That's tricky. Well, I guess there are different ways of going, but my mother just having died 2 weeks ago, I guess I will mention her, because it was an implicit impact, in the sense that my mother, born in 1921 and married just shortly after World War II, got caught in a world in which opportunities for women were limited. Being an oldest child of 3 daughters meant she took on a lot of the responsibility of the family. And my dad was very protective of her and viewed himself as the breadwinner and not her. And so I think her limits in the social world, not being able to develop a profession and not going to college in the way that I did. She was a child of immigrants from Russia. That had a large impact on me. It was very identity forming. So it wasn't necessarily, in the sense, inspiring or modeling, but it was something that I knew I wanted to surpass in a certain way. So my parents gave me the opportunities for education, which were enormous, enormous gift, especially in America where everyone can't go to university freely, or public universities. And so that was a huge, huge gift. And I guess sort of coupled with that, my husband's aunt, who died at 107, had a very different experience. She was a school teacher, but trained in a teaching school called a normal school, I guess from the French as an école normale. And she was really a professional woman, a remarkable woman, single, and very, very highly educated and serious intellectual. And she was also an influence as a contrast case for me to my own mother. So I had some good models out there, and I keep them in mind regularly.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that, and obviously I completely appreciate you being able to do this interview within such close proximity to this difficult time. But finally, is there anywhere that my listeners can go from here to follow you, or how can they best become involved in what you're doing right now?
So I have a website called nancysherman.com.
Yep.
And you should be able to see the books that I've written and where I've been recently, what I'm up to, and catch a few photos of me. But definitely, I would encourage folks to look at After War, or certainly Stoic Warriors or Untold War, and see what I'm up to that way. Reading is the best way, I think, to sort of see how I deal with hard material, and bring it to bear on hard questions of the world that we're facing now.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll absolutely put the links to those books in the show notes so that everybody can get them there, and I highly recommend that they do so.
Thank you. And they are available at vendors of your choice, including Amazon.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Nancy, I just want to thank you so much again. This has just been such a pleasure for myself, as well as the audience. I know that they will absolutely love this interview, and they'll learn so much from you. So thank you again, and look, we'd love to talk to you again sometime.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simon. My pleasure.
Thanks.
A good chat. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there you have it, Nancy Sherman. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed this interview as much as I enjoyed asking those questions. You know, she just had such an in-depth knowledge of philosophy, and that comes from a lifetime of learning and teaching. And I was so grateful that she gave us the time to come on this show and share that knowledge with us. So look, all I want to say is, in the future, guys, if you have any recommendations for me for people who you'd like to hear on the podcast, please message them through. I know that a lot of you have sent me recommendations, and this has been a particularly busy time for me, so I haven't had a chance to actually action on those requests, but please keep on sending them, because I am keeping a list, and I want to make sure that I get to everybody that you guys want to hear. So I will leave it at that. I'll talk to you next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. I hope it's been valuable for you. And if you'd like to support the show, then you can go to patreon.com/Simon Drew. If you'd like to try mindset coaching with me, then you can book your first free consultation by going to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching. To join the community, just go to Facebook and search for the Practical Stoic Mastermind. The links to all of these places are included in the show notes, but for now, this is Simon Drew signing out.